Welcome to the Under 8 Podcast, a daily college basketball show brought to you every weekday in under 8 minutes at the time of recording. It is Monday, January 15th, 4:44 p.m. My name is Josh Mullenix. On today's pod, a new set of AP polls, and Marquette bounces back against Villanova at home. It's all right now on the Under 8 Podcast. For the first time, Josh Doering here with me. Happy birthday.
Thank you.
For the first time since 2009, which is kind of wild, by the way. The Connecticut Huskies, UConn, the Fighting Dan Hurleys, number one in this week's AP poll, one of four teams to get first place votes, but they were easily the favorite, easily taking the number one spot in this week's AP poll.
Hard to really argue with it, considering Purdue has lost twice here recently.
Right.
Because you and I are both big believers that just because you lose doesn't mean you have to go from the number one spot. But when it happens 2 weeks in a row and UConn is just taking care of business, it does show, right, that you had four teams with the first place votes. It was by no means unanimous, but ultimately I think it's the right decision. And it is kind of weird that, yeah, because Purdue was also undefeated in non-conference last year, there just hasn't been a point where UConn has actually been the best team in the country during the regular season. They just, go win national championships sometimes.
Yeah, that just seems to be the thing that they end up doing, which if you ask them to pick, do you want to be number one in the AP poll, or at the end of the season, you want to be the only team that ends the year with a win? I think it's pretty obvious which one they would pick. They did get to number two last year.
Yep.
In the December 19th and December 26th AP polls, they were number two. I believe, that would have been when Purdue, I think.
Yeah, that was,
lost yet.
Right. Purdue was also undefeated in non-conference. Yeah.
And then, of course, we know what happened to UConn early in conference play. I mean, the first third of conference play, really. They drop all the way to 24th in the January 30th poll, make it back all the way up to 10th in the final AP poll, and then, of course, win the national championship. So that stretch that they went on in November and December got them very close, but not quite to the tippity top. But, Josh, the story is in a week when lots of conferences, lots of teams lost, whether it was a road game in conference play to a quality opponent, and had hiccups along the way. UConn just taking care of business, in this week, they beat Xavier on the road. They got to play Georgetown at home, beat a feisty Butler team that was in that game at Hinkle Fieldhouse for basically the entire thing. But in a week where some of the other top teams in the country took losses in conference play, it was UConn that held strong, didn't end up with a loss, and is able to ascend to the top of the rankings.
Really, the big story here for me, and I talked about this on Thursday because it was pretty clear it was going to happen. Gonzaga only got 5 points.
Right.
That is a 143-week AP top 25 streak that got snapped. Not surprising. They lost as of, 23 or something to Santa Clara.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were going to be out of the poll. So that, to me, is the other storyline here. The fact that Kansas didn't move sums up how the week went.
Yeah.
Right?
Very much so.
You win some, you lose some. They got a really good win over Oklahoma at home, so that's enough to just keep you right there. You got Baylor up 5 spots. Wisconsin, who probably, if they had started a little bit better, would be a top, 5 to 8 team in the country right now with the way they're playing, what they're doing in the Big Ten, up to 11. Utah State, 16. Creighton, 18. They all moved up 4 spots. Those are some of your big winners. The other thing, did you count how many Big 12 teams are in there?
I have not. I can do it quickly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Is that correct?
Yep.
That's a lot of teams. So that's my quick math. That's a fourth of basically just under a third of the poll is Big 12 teams.
Yeah. 8 of the 14, over half of the conference is ranked.
Sure.
Now, part of this is, okay, they did have 24 and 25 at Iowa State and Texas Tech. But also, that's a pretty good 24 and 25 considering how they're playing right now. Now, I know neither of them had great resumes before they got to Big 12 play. But it was a very clear, these teams are going to be ranked on Monday. The question is where. And they just snuck in. But you can make an argument they should have been closer to 20. So really, really impressive there. Marquette, Oklahoma dropped 6 spots. Arizona's down to 12. Those are some of the other notable movements. But yeah, there was a lot going on here. I'm not usually excited to see AP polls, but both the men's and women's sides this week were pretty interesting because of everything that happened in the last week.
The last thing I'll throw out there before we get to the women's top 25, North Carolina, a team that a lot of people have on their very short list for Final Four at this point, that's playing maybe like the best team in the country. There are not many teams that have an argument against North Carolina right now. Move up from 7 to 4th, but also receiving a vote, just one, but a vote for the number 1 team in the country, which is significant, and I think a good way to measure and see just how well Hubert Davis's team is playing right now.
I have no issue with North Carolina getting first place votes, none whatsoever. Right now,
in a week like this, absolutely not. Absolutely,
that's the best. I mean, they probably have the best resume in the country at this point, right?
Got to be one of them.
With the non-conference schedule they played and the fact that they've kind of survived it, and now, okay, maybe they got an extra loss in there that the UConns and Purdue's don't have, but generally they're in the ballpark with all the other top 5 teams. And of course, Purdue really tested themselves. It's not like North Carolina's the only team that played a hard schedule, but they had that stretch where they were just playing ranked opponents every game, it felt like. So yeah, absolutely. They're playing really, really well. And I mean, I think it's just 2 ACC teams that are ranked, UNC and Duke. So there's a lot more wins coming from the Tar Heels. I'll put it that way.
I'll be surprised if we see UNC outside of the top 10, 6, 7 in the AP poll anytime soon, unless they take a loss against an ACC team they shouldn't. So I suppose it's a little bit of a double-edged sword that it might not be as hard to stay up there as it would be if you're in the Big 12. But if you lose one game that you shouldn't, then you might drop. But that's the men's poll. On the women's side of things, South Carolina, now the only undefeated team in the top 25. Do you know, is there another undefeated team anywhere in the country?
I don't believe so.
South Carolina, 15-0 after some losses to undefeated teams this week, get all 36 first place votes. Caitlin Clark and the Iowa Hawkeyes move up to number 2, but it's still the Gamecocks strong in that number 1 spot.
Yeah, that has a lot to do with USC beating UCLA. Juju Watkins is something else. We didn't specifically mention this game, so I wanted to bring it up here. Those are just really fun matchups between those 2 teams. They're now 5th and 6th. There's not a lot to split between them resume-wise. That's going to be a really, really fun race down the stretch because there's obviously lots of Pac-12 games left, and they are very much neck and neck. All kinds of talent there. Colorado gets a top 10 win over Stanford. They're up to 3rd right behind Iowa. LSU inexplicably loses to Auburn. That's a huge win for the Auburn program, so they're down to 10. Shout out Kansas State, highest ranking since 2003, up to 7. UConn, who I was thinking about this, has basically flipped their schedule where they play the non-conference, the more difficult part first, and then they get to Big East play, where they're just destroying. Now, yes, there are some ranked Big East teams at the end there, Creighton and Marquette, but UConn's just obliterating people now, so they're up to number 9. Baylor, rough week, down to 12. And then Florida State's the other team I wanted to mention real quickly. We talked about them a couple weeks ago. They gave North Carolina State all they could handle, and then they beat North Carolina and Virginia Tech. So really good week for Florida State. They're up to 15. That was the other really notable team for me.
Do you think South Carolina loses in the regular season?
You know what? I'm going to say yes.
Okay.
Because of the existence of LSU, because as you're seeing this season, there are some good teams in the SEC that aren't getting a lot of credit, or that the bottom of that conference is legit, as LSU just learned with that Auburn game.
Yeah.
So this is not one of those juggernaut South Carolina teams. At least I'm not convinced it is yet, where they're just going to destroy everybody because they've got, 4 future top 10 WNBA picks and 4 All-Americans on it and things like that. Clearly, they're the best team in the country right now. But if I had to guess, between the regular season and the NCAA, they are not going to go undefeated and win the tournament.
Okay. In the next 2 weeks, they go at LSU. They go at that Auburn team that just beat LSU. They still have a game against UConn on the schedule. That's on February 11th. So there will be days where South Carolina will go against teams that, at least whether it's, you have no doubt they have the talent, or against teams that have proven that on the right night they can beat really high level teams. So plenty of challenges to come over the next month and a half or so before we get to the tournament. But we're now getting to the point where it needs to at least be part of the discussion. Is, are we going to see a wire to wire performance from South Carolina this year?
Sure.
Really, there were a couple games of note. Today, Michigan actually beating Ohio State is one
with
that
the Fab Five in attendance.
There you go. Ohio State's, ability to win Big Ten games at any consistent rate is something that is haunting Chris Holtmann and his tenure in Columbus at this point. They just start to look like a completely different team once you get to Big Ten play, and it doesn't really matter what you do in non-conference if you can't back it up with a quality conference performance. And you're not even getting semi-average conference performances from Ohio State the last couple of years. It's been pretty grim, and it would be tough to see them really go down a slippery slope after the first half of the season that they've had. Specifically, what we're going to touch on real quick: number 17 Marquette 87, Villanova 74. This game was probably a little closer than that score suggests. It was not a foregone conclusion, halfway through the second half, who was going to win this game. Marquette pulling away with an 8-0 run in the last couple of minutes. But this was a game that, Josh, you could go all the way to, 7:45 left in this game. It was 61, 8:32. It was 59-57. And then Marquette, for at least the majority of the last 5 minutes, kind of keeping Villanova at arm's length, but it was more at a 6 to 8 point arm's length, not a 10 to 12 to 14 point arm's length, but went on a little bit of a run, and it went from 74-68 to 85-71 in the last couple minutes, but still a competitive game in Milwaukee this afternoon.
The first half was balanced. Marquette won the points in the paint battle 34-8, and Villanova shot 9 of 18 from 3. Therefore, very close game at halftime. And then it continued to slowly go in Marquette's favor, where Villanova only hits 5 threes in the second half. Oso Agudaro continues to dominate. Tyler Kolek gets going. Yeah, Villanova hung in there for about 30 minutes. And then slowly but surely, Marquette, as you would expect, at home in a game that they really needed to get this thing on track, to keep themselves at least somewhat alive in the Big East title race, to not let this spiral out of control. They needed to get this win, and they showed up and did just that.
Yeah, big story here for me is that Tyler Kolek kind of stopped this mini free fall he was on in the last couple of games, heading into this game in their back-to-back losses to Seton Hall and Butler. 2 of 19 from the field, 1 of 10 from deep. Still doing his thing in the assist category, but he got back on the right track in this game. He had 21 on 7 of 14 shooting. The 3-point shooting still an issue for Marquette. They're down to 250th or so in the country. They're the worst 3-point shooting team in the Big East thus far. But and they were 7 of 23 and at one point 5 of 20. So they finished 2 of 3 from the 3-point line. So to make that look like a little bit better of a 30% as a team. But when Tyler Kolek is 21, 11, and 5 and has 11 assists to 2 turnovers and is efficient from the field, this Marquette team, scores 87 points. They're, the top 10 offense in the country that they're advertised to be. So it was nice to see him get back on track after a pretty grim couple of games shooting for the All-American.
And they need him to if they're not going to hit threes.
Yep.
They're good enough. I do think they're good enough to survive without it. Are they good enough to win the conference without shooting the ball? Probably not, just because UConn's been so good.
Yeah.
But they're good enough to win these kind of games as long as they dominate inside and Iguodaro and Kolek play up to what we know they're capable of, which is exactly what happened in this game.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to mention on Marquette's side too, Sean Jones, unfortunately done for the year. Chase Ross unavailable for this game. All of a sudden, you're running out of players. But Ben Gold, Trey Norman, Zay Lowry, your guys off the bench, maybe they weren't spectacular, but Lowry hit a couple of threes. They made things happen. That was the other part of this that I was looking at is, okay, can you get production from more than 5 guys? And in this game, the answer was yes. That's going to be important for Marquette moving forward too, because Sean Jones, unfortunately, is not coming back.
Yeah.
You need to find other guys to produce, and they did find that in this one.
I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the fact that Cam Jones was 10 of 12 from the field in this game, 22, 6, and 4. He was excellent. Marquette's guys were awesome, right? I mean, it was 21 from Kolek, 22 from Jones, 18 from Iguodaro. You got, 9 from Stevie Mitchell, David Joplin, 7 points. It was, those 3 guys are going to be the guys that carry Marquette as far as they're going to go, especially as you mentioned, start to run out of players. But when you get that and you get some production elsewhere, Ben Gold doesn't score in this game, but he has 3 blocks and 3 assists. So impacting the game in other ways, it was clearly enough to beat Villanova on this particular day. We'll just see if this version of Marquette that dug themselves the hole that they did in Big East play has enough firepower to get themselves back into the Big East conversation.
They kind of did this last year too. I don't think it was this extreme, but I believe they lost at least their first conference game.
They won at home against Creighton to begin conference play and then lost to Providence. In game 2.
So they have done this before. Now the difference is that UConn fell apart immediately.
Yeah.
So you weren't chasing a UConn team that is playing its best basketball even without having Donovan Clingan. So that's different. The other thing for Villanova, if you're going to take a positive here, they did play pretty well. Defensively, they got to figure some things out because they could not stop anybody. Mm-hmm. But also, Mark Armstrong is scoring the basketball for the first time in his career.
Yeah. 14, 15, 24 in the last 3 games.
And shooting the ball well. That is a really, really good thing, even if it doesn't transform this season. Just moving forward to finally see him start to realize his potential and play at a really, really high level. That's something good for Kyle Neptune if you can take away. And ultimately, it's probably going to come down to the non-conference schedule and how that plays out. I mean, that North Carolina win just keeps looking better and better.
Yep.
Also, you lost the Philly 5 games, but they're not going to go 16-4 in conference or something. They're probably right about where they're going to be. They're going to win most of their conference games, but not all of them. And they'll probably win some of the tougher games, like they beat Creighton, and they're not going to win at Marquette yet. The question is it going to be ultimately enough to put them where they want to be because of what they did to themselves with being so inconsistent in non-conference?
Villanova has wins over Maryland, Texas Tech. They in 4 straight games beat Maryland, Texas Tech, North Carolina, and Memphis in 4 straight games, and then rattled off losses to St. Joe's, Drexel, and Kansas State, which is not, nobody's faulting you for losing on the road at Kansas State, and then picked it right back up with 4 straight wins: UCLA, Creighton, DePaul, and Xavier. I'm very frustrated with how I have to feel about Villanova because they couldn't be the best team in Philly this year.
Right.
Or because they are the best team in Philly this year. They just didn't show it in the games against Philly teams.
And they're looking like still one of the best 4 teams in the Big East.
Yes. They aren't that far away from where now they're not quite the I'm not sure that being a top 4 team in the Big East is completely what I thought it was going to mean.
Sure.
But ultimately, Villanova's not that far away from where we thought they were going to be. It's just clouded both their resume and just the way that people feel about them. It clouded by the inexplicable performance that they, presented in the Big 5 games this year.
And maybe it's 5th because St. John's is playing really good basketball, right? And Seton Hall also playing really good. So they're in that conversation between 4 to 6, though, which is basically where everybody thought they'd be.
Right. You got anything else?
I was going to mention the Michigan game, but you already talked about it. At least they got a win, and I really thought this Ohio State thing was sorted out. Evidently not. That's a tough loss. That I know road games are tough, no matter where you are, no matter who you're playing in the Big Ten. You gotta find a way to win them somewhere, though, and that's one of the easier ones on your schedule, and they couldn't get it done.
Yep. Some fun conference action to get into tomorrow. You've got an all Indiana showdown. Purdue heading to Simon Scott Assembly Hall, which is never something that is easy to do for the Boilermakers. Florida versus Tennessee. There will be plenty to talk about. Baylor takes on Kansas State in a top 25 matchup between Iowa State and BYU. So plenty to talk about tomorrow. We'll talk about it then. That's going to do it for today, though. Monday, January 15th. It is just after 5 p.m. Eastern. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to your shows. Follow the Under 8 Pod on Twitter. Subscribe on YouTube. And we will see you tomorrow.